Thanks, Bernie. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's now my great pleasure to introduce Bernie Hobbs, who's our moderator for this evening's panel. Bernie's an award-winning science writer and broadcaster for the ABC Science. Now, I only met her this evening. It's been a glorious conversation already. I've learnt two things. One is that she still thinks I've got a really Kiwi accent after being here for 20 years. Sorry. No, I don't think so. The other thing is that we share a love of the same shirt maker, Quebec, and we're going to start a kind of recycling kind of a thing for our Quebec shirts. So if anyone wants to join, you're more than welcome. So Bernie joined ABC Science in 1997, and since then she's had extensive experience in television, including programs such as The New Investors, Catalyst, and The Experimentals. She's also prolific on radio and online, and she has been on the science... I'm struggling to read my really bad writing. She's been on the science reporting side of climate change since Kyoto, so it's a really long time and really prolific. So welcome, Bernie. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Cheers. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks, IGCC, for having us here tonight and having this conversation at the end of what sounds like I wasn't invited today. So, and I wasn't comped either, but, not holding that against you. So, but it does sound from all reports like it's been a really interesting day, lots of great speakers, some ordinary ones, we won't focus on them, and some challenging ideas and things like taxonomy, which I got excited about as a former scientist, but then learned it's more of a financial thing. So today's been great. Tonight, Emma had this great idea of a light-hearted conversation about why the hell climate change is so damn hard. So thanks for that, Emma. I think there's an expression for when you're past... a dead ball like that or something. But anyway, someone will remember it at some stage during the night. So I am rapt to be here, and we have got 3 speakers here tonight who you're going to be rapt with over the next 40-odd minutes. The premise is this. A scientist, a politician and a social scientist walk into a bar after a hard day and many years of failure on climate action in the global scene. And this is the conversation that ensues. I just happen to be a barfly who might be a bit nosy and prodding. So our first speaker this evening is our climate scientist, Michael E. Mann. So Michael's Distinguished Professor at University of Pennsylvania. Yeah, he deserves a little clap or two because... Partly because if you have ever heard of the hockey stick graph, the graph that was published in the late 90s, it's like a J-curve but turned around and stretched out. I don't know. I thought J-curve was the only economics thing I had as a touchstone. So the hockey stick graph showed for the first time with some solid maths from data that over 1,000-odd years that carbon dioxide emissions were on the increase, and they were on the increase because of burning of fossil fuels. So Michael became a bit of a star of the face of climate science outspokenness, which also unbelievably made him a target for the climate deniers. So please join me in welcoming Michael up to the stage. So that's our climate scientist walking into the bar. It's obviously October, so we've just got glasses of water at the bar. It's kind of a low-budget bar, and obviously not one to pick up at because the lighting is really unflattering up here. Our politician who ambled into the bar will be familiar to everyone in the room. Bob Carr was, of course, former Premier of New South Wales for 10 years, famously introduced the greenhouse abatement scheme. As you did a couple of other things. That wasn't your only show in the 10 years. You were Foreign Minister under the Rudd and Gillard governments, and now you're at the Institute of Sustainable Futures and the Business School at UTS, where you're an industry professor trying to agitate and get policy agendas up and running to drive some change in this sector. So would you please welcome to the stage our politician, the Honourable Bob Carr. Bob, that's my chair. Yeah. No, Bob, in the middle. See, it's just like a 1, 2, 3 thing. Okay. So I need you within arm's reach because I feel like I would like to hear from all of the speakers tonight. So our third speaker this evening, Dr. Rebecca Colvin, is a social scientist, which means she doesn't really have a proper title. She's not a psychologist. She's not anything really, but she's worked extensively. She's got a PhD. She works extensively in social science and communications and trying to understand how the hell you can get head-butting groups to come together on any issue. What are the drivers that keep them apart? What are some possible things that could bring them together? And Beck's been studying this stuff for her PhD and then more recently in the school, the Crawford School at ANU. I just wanted to really highlight the school she was from, drawing a lot of attention to it there by faux forgetting. So would you join me in welcoming Dr. Beck Colvin? Tragically, you would think this is some kind of power play, but it really is because I only have one good side. So I always like to sit on the left of a panel. So here we are in this bar. I mean, I think we're all pretty familiar with this situation. Catherine said I've been in this game, like a lot of you, been interested and concerned about climate change for a very long time, since Kyoto, and I don't think anyone who's been around that long would have expected to see that we are still at the position we're at today. Like, I can't imagine. Did anyone predict this complete level of inaction? Not even you, Bob? No. Okay. All right. Well, because you're in politics, and I thought you might have had some insights. So, I mean, it's not that there's been no change. It's not that there's been no change. Like, if you look back to 1987... from the International Energy Association's reports, in 1987, 81% of our electricity globally came from fossil fuels. So 1987, before climate change was on the radar other than in science groups. And then, over this time we've had Kyoto, we've had Paris, we've had emissions trading schemes come and go, we've had carbon prices fleetingly, we've had a whole lot of stuff going. We've got the phenomenal uptake of renewables globally as well. So now, 30 years later, the proportion of our energy that comes from fossil fuels is 81%. So we might have done a lot, but nothing has actually changed. And I shouldn't say nothing has changed, because that growth, that 1% incremental growth in our emissions that was fairly consistent has changed. It hit 2% growth last year. So there's a lot of news, tragically none of it good. But Emma said a light-hearted discussion about the end of the world. So here we are at the bar. Now, obviously, so we've got climate science represented, we've got politics and policy represented, we've got social change and cultural understanding represented. It's no one of you's fault, like, individually, but each of you obviously has to carry a portion of the blame for the complete inaction. Michael, let's start with you. The hockey stick, you were off to such a good start with that peak in 98. What has gone so horribly wrong? Why? What is it about the climate science that has just not worked?
Well, so the problem is really just one Australian.
Is it anyone on the panel?
Fortunately not. But it is the fact that we have a massive international disinformation campaign that has been promoted by fossil fuel interests and certain media outlets who have basically been advocates for those interests. The United States and Australia being two countries with especially entrenched fossil fuel interests, and not surprisingly, that is where climate change denial has perhaps been most rampant and most effective in sort of interfering with prospects for climate action. Now, I was going to respond to the point you made about nobody predicting this, because back in 1995, in the book The Demon-Haunted World, Carl Sagan actually presaged the future that we've arrived at. If you read the book...
With a complete lack of action...
Well, in a sense, he predicted the rise of Trumpism, the descent into an environment of pseudoscience and anti-science where we become so separated in terms of the understanding of the public from the technology that we rely upon that we fall victim to forces of denial and inaction. Now, he didn't foresee the fossil fuel industry being that force, but he essentially saw the potential for that to happen.
It's kind of surprising because, it's exactly out of the cigarettes, the tobacco lobby's playbook to do exactly this, create doubt side of things. So, but can I take you back? I know how you deflected just then, like it's not science's fault, it's the deniers. But really, science, come on, is there anything that in going back you would do differently? You've been trying to explain the science of climate change you have been explaining it, but trying to explain it effectively, get some traction for all this time. Yeah. Is there anything you or science could have done better?
Yeah, black holes. I should have gone into theoretical physics. That's what I was studying at the time. Things would have been so much easier.
People would have been interested. You would have had the 6-year-olds queuing to hear you speak.
No, scientists, we rely, we're often naive, and we were naive and continue to be as a community in the notion that all we have to do is simply publish the science, and then policymakers and the general public will absorb that and make enlightened policy based on the findings of science. Of course, we understand that that's not the case because we don't exist in a neutral atmosphere. We exist in an atmosphere where there are vested interests and bad actors who are looking to poison the public discourse over climate change. It's for some of us to actually become far more active in trying to communicate the science and its implications to the public, recognizing we do have a role in doing that.
And what about, I think a lot of scientists are really picking up on this role and doing a great job, but what about, for so long, I just wanted a scientist to just forget the caveat that, well, we can't be 100% certain and just be a bit more hardline about this. Do you think that would have made any difference? Because it just felt like you were just giving the science to the denialist lobby on a platter.
Yeah. So absolutely. For a long time, it was sort of a bad communication 101 that apparently every climate scientist learned at some point, that you lead with your uncertainty. When a journalist asks you if there's a connection between these unprecedented extreme weather events that have never happened before and were predicted by your models decades ago, can you make a connection? And the first thing out of the mouth of the scientist is, well, you can never relate any one event, and as soon as, that's left their mouth, the public is tuned out. They've decided, okay, there's nothing here, there's nothing to listen to.
Great science, bad survival strategy for species on the planet.
Lead with what you do know. We do know that collectively we would not be seeing these unprecedented extreme weather events that have become obvious to the public. Even the public gets it. There is something happening. Why not concede that the science supports that? And, we can talk about uncertainty, we can talk about caveats, but lead with what you do know. We would not be seeing these unprecedented, damaging extreme weather events in the absence of human-caused warming of the planet.
Okay, so science could have done a better job. The modelling has been great, took a long time to really get to a point where science was happy with it. Could have done a better job, but all in all, it's the fossil fuel and denialists. Oh, and who was that Australian that you didn't name earlier?
Rupert something, I don't know.
Sorry, American, yeah.
We do not accept him as such.
He's not the only American you'd be ashamed of right now, I'm sure. Well, I'd like to come back in a moment to talk a bit about what it's been like on the coalface as a climate scientist and the sorts of stuff you've had to go through. But Bob, do you think politics have had a role in absolutely nothing happening in the last 22 years we're talking about?
Well, there was a magic moment when it seemed there was a consensus here and in the United States, everywhere else, that pricing carbon would send a message to investors but done in a nuanced way through an emissions trading scheme, it wouldn't alarm, it wouldn't hurt household budgets. And if John Howard, the consensus was so strong that if John Howard and not Kevin Rudd had won the 2007 election, a scheme would have been enacted.
It's Kevin Rudd's fault.
It would have passed. Our side complicated things by winning the election and then having a long inquiry into the... I'm being critical deliberately of my own side to show my
bipartisanship,
legendary sense of balance.
Well, you're an academic now, Bob, so yeah, you're beyond politics.
But Kevin did decide we'd have a long inquiry, Professor Ross Garneau's inquiry, when I do think that taking the New South Wales greenhouse gas scheme and enacting it federally was a better option. But anyway...
That's your scheme
by
that you...
By 2009, we thought that with the support of the coalition, it would be enacted, an emissions trading scheme. Gradually pricing carbon, but in a way that households would hardly notice, but sending a very strong a very strong message to investors all that way back. At that very moment, the coalition, this is the importance of politics, was captured by climate change denialism. They spoke about it, Tony Abbott spoke about it, he became leader, the coalition voted to defer, so did the Green Party, Kevin Rudd's legislation. And it never came back. It never came back. And of course, our side may have been at fault, because if Kevin had said, and there are many people in the party who think this was an option, had said, OK, double dissolution material, we'll go to the people. He was still popular enough at that time to have done what most first-term governments do, going to the people after 2 years, not 3 years in government, in a double dissolution, and getting returned, and of course getting that legislation up through that route. But that was the magic political moment, and we missed the opportunity. But just think of the capture of Australian conservatives by climate change denialism and ask, as Michael did, where was that coming from?
And where was it coming from?
I don't think you can tell the story of this this disastrous policy failure in Australia or in the United States, without saying it was an American pathology, spread, crop dusted over our political landscape by the news limited media. Climate change denialism didn't come from Europe. It hasn't come from Norway and Holland and Germany and France. It hasn't come from there. It's an American creation funded by people like preeminently the Koch brothers, K-O-C-H, billionaires who put hundreds of millions of dollars into converting the American political system to the idea that climate change talk was a Marxist conspiracy designed to bring down capitalism.
And so, hang on, so the Koch brothers, how did they sway Murdoch? Was that just advertising dollars? What was their power to get the Murdoch press?
You might be able to answer that better than I.
I mean, it was a coalition that basically formed between ideologically driven actors like the Koch brothers, profit-driven actors like Rupert Murdoch, and there has been a campaign underway for decades by fossil fuel interest groups to influence the public discourse over climate change. So there are multiple actors who came together to do this, but the one commonality is the profiting from the sale of fossil fuels.
Right, so in the Venn diagram of evil, sitting in that overlap bit right in the middle there, we've got Murdoch.
That language probably doesn't help us. I prefer a different approach. I've been talking to some people on the right and saying, why is it that to be on the conservative side of politics
in Australia,
you can't reach the view that we ought to conserve our planetary home? It strikes me as a logical extension of you want to conserve the values, you want to conserve certain political views. There is a case for conservatism, but surely it shouldn't be. Surely it's anomalous that you're excluding the possibility of conserving the natural world and its systems, and particularly that part of the natural world that is the thin filigree of air that surrounds our planet and which we've used as a dumping ground to the extent that is causing climate change.
That's absolutely right. It's important to understand the history of how this issue emerged ultimately as an issue of the conservative right, because it wasn't always that way. Richard Nixon gave us the Environmental Protection Agency. George H.W. Bush gave us cap and trade, tradable emissions schemes for dealing with acid rain. Ronald Reagan signed the Montreal Protocol to ban chlorofluorocarbons.
Did he know what he was signing?
Well, there's some question about that. He thought it was a horoscope that he was... No. Then George W. Bush, who's often been vilified in the context of sort of the path we've taken on climate, actually appointed a pro-environment moderate Republican, Christine Todd Whitman, as EPA administrator, who declared CO2 as a pollutant to be regulated under the Clean Air Act. It was midway through Bush's first term when Whitman was shoved aside, Bush was shoved aside, Dick Cheney came in and took over and brought in the energy interests to take over that party. There's a wonderful film by Adam McKay, Vice. I don't know if any of you have seen it.
Oh, brilliant, brilliant.
It's a wonderful
must
film.
see. Everyone must see this film.
Can I say that is about the 6th recommendation of a show we've had from Bob? I don't know what work you're doing at the ISF, but you've got a hell of a lot of screen time.
You see Succession, the treatment, Succession.
Yeah. We'll get back to Succession.
Media family, you've got to see that because
Yeah,
it goes
no,
it's
what
we're
Michael, back
Finish the point, and then we need to hear from Beck.
Yes.
So actually that film is ultimately about how we have arrived in this dystopian climate change world as a result, essentially, of that intervention, the intervention by Dick Cheney and the energy interests midway through the first term of George W. Bush. That's when the Republican Party became a wholly owned subsidiary of the fossil fuel industry.
So was that 2000 or?
That's 2002, roughly.
2002, okay.
About the same time the Frank Luntz memo that we were talking about came out.
There's a book, in case you're tired of the screen recommendations. Can I just clarify one thing? So you were talking about Murdoch and the profit motive there being a very strong driver. But Murdoch was in the media business, so he wasn't, a change in fossil fuels, a carbon tax wasn't going to affect him. So what extension of that was it that was driving him?
Does anyone here know who the second largest shareholder of News Corp stock was? It wasn't Murdoch. Who's the second largest shareholder?
Exxon, BHP?
Kingdom Holding, the Saudi royal family.
Oh. So did anyone just feel like two dots just join in a line then? Thank you.
I wouldn't overwork that. I mean, that's terrifically interesting and I'm sure important, but there is an attraction within the whole News Limited empire to an anti-leftist agenda, and through a leap of logic, they've defined climate change as being anti-capitalist, and this permeates
Not helpful.
all the media stables owned by News. It's the conventional wisdom. Groupthink is on the left and the right of journalism is a very potent force, and they've persuaded themselves they need no prompting from the second biggest shareholder. They need no prompting. They've persuaded themselves that talk of climate change action is part of a Marxist attempt to change the nature of the American economy, and that is threaded through all the two columns on the.
So
opinion
not
pages,
directly.
Only today.
Yeah.
Only today.
So how great. Well, the Herald on Saturday just had fantastic coverage right throughout about policy direction. Anyway, that's great, Bob, because that clarifies that it's not directly Murdoch's own value, but more his concern for the capitalist system that was the capitalism system. Now, Beck, so you have not just done a PhD, but you're at the probably the Carleton Institute. What is it? Crawford, exactly, like Reg Crawford. I'm going to remember that now. Okay, so the Crawford Institute, you're looking very much at what it is about human beings that makes this kind of change hard, and what are the things that could go some way towards making those kinds of things possible. And you've described the setup of the whole action on climate change as pretty much a perfect storm. So can you tell us why, not why you've failed personally as a social scientist? And yeah, you'll get off the hook, yeah, because it took so long to get to her, I had to move on to the next topic. So what is it about our well, first of all, give us that picture of why it's a perfect storm, and then why that has meant that social science and culture and behaviour change has failed abysmally.
Sure. Unfortunately, I think a big part of it goes back to politics. And
nice handball, nice deflect, yeah.
And we can think about it as both political ideology and political affiliation. And these things operate in different ways, in very interconnected ways. But one of the challenges is that through particular lenses with which climate change has been understood to be in opposition to a particular ideology, that's filtered up to fit in with a political affiliation. And so now it's become this issue of who we are, if we identify with one political party or one political world of thought over another. We've wrapped climate change up into that sense of our worldview, our sense of self. And so we don't necessarily debate about climate change because we want to know what the, whatever, I don't do the numbers, the angle on the hockey stick is, but we debate about it because it feels like a sense of showing the world that we have value, or that our way of being in the world has value over something else. But I actually think there are positive changes. And I'm not usually one to go to optimism. I'm feeling desperately pessimistic at this point in the year 2019, not uniquely today, but the public opinion data is shifting in Australia dramatically, massively dramatically. So I noted some figures. The Lowy Institute polling said back in 2012, 35% of Australians thought climate change is an important issue and we should act immediately. As of last year, that was up to 60%. That's pretty significant. The same time, from 2012 to 2018, the number of people who deny that climate change is happening has gone from 20% to 10%. Other data as well is showing us that there's a massive perception gap within the Australian population, where we overestimate what proportion of other Australians are actively denying climate change. So different source, but the Australia Institute in their Climate of the Nation study found 3% of Australians think climate change isn't happening.
Wow.
But if you ask people, how much of the population do you think thinks climate change isn't happening? The number's 13%. So there's a 10 percentage point perception gap. And the perception gap really matters because it stifles conversation. It reinforces this idea that climate change is a taboo. You don't bring it up at polite dinner parties, aside from tonight, perhaps. It's wrapped in with politics and sexuality and religion and all of these other things that we don't talk about.
We'll be getting to those in just a minute.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. But we've also got the evidence that one of the most effective ways to really boost this idea that people need to think climate change is something we should deal with, something that we might personally make changes with response to, and in particular make civic changes through our activities as members of a democracy, is through conversations among trusted people with friends and family. And we're seeing this now, and having these numbers changing and making it more acceptable to talk about climate change. One of the things that's changing it is people like yourselves that aren't, as far as I can tell, Birkenstock-wearing, dreadlock-wearing, lefty, greeny hippies. Climate change has been pigeonholed with this particular identity, and it's shut down a whole raft of opportunities for people that don't fit into that particular worldview to engage with it. And so having people that aren't the usual suspects talking about climate change, seeing that there is this groundswell of support, maybe not manifesting yet at the political stage, but I think we could actually be at a time of pretty significant shift.
So we've always had a few of those. So like we've had Ian Dunlop, the former head of Shell, being outspoken on this for more than a decade now. But Is it that we haven't got the numbers that what is it going to take to really get that swing to happen? Because that stuff has been happening in a way for a decade or more. Still no traction.
Political leadership really matters. There's a great study from a couple of years ago that looked at, if you ask Australians, would you support an emissions trading scheme? You get a fairly predictable pattern in the responses. So coalition voters, about 49% would say they'd vote for it. Greens voters, it was 97%. Labor voters, 90% approximately. If you then modify the question and you say, would you support an emissions trading scheme? Both Malcolm Turnbull and Bill Shorten, who were at the time the leaders of the two major parties, both Malcolm Turnbull and Bill Shorten support it. Those numbers changed substantially. So coalition voters went from 49% up to 58%. That's a really big change just from adding an extra sentence into how you ask a question. Greens and Labor voters went down by about the same margin because I guess it's not connected in with their particular political group anymore.
You're describing tribalism. Tribalism.
Yes.
This is lost out because it's become a debate between the tribes.
And this is, I suppose, what I've found one of the most useful ways to understand this absolute quagmire that we've locked ourselves into. Understanding the social identities that climate change is wrapped up in. It's connected with politics, absolutely, in Australia. So, in fact, a meta-analysis, I don't know if that's obscure academic talk.
Oh, I've got a meta fan.
But basically, it's where you get a whole lot of different studies together and you analyse the results together so you can make conclusions that you have more confidence in. It's looked at the determinants of attitudes toward climate change. The left-right political divide is really significant in Australia, second only to the United States. The US and Australia are uniquely different from the rest of the world in this way. So we've got a silver medal for being terrible, which is also gold medal goes to Michael. I can't even remember.
To the US, Michael.
But it's wrapped up in these social identities that we have. But we've got decades and decades and decades of scholarship from social psychologists and social scientists that have looked at what happens once things get locked into these identities. How can we navigate through the conflict? How can we get past these logjams? And this is where there's some real answers that could be helping us to move forward.
Like what?
Having messengers that come from within the group that you're trying to get the message through to. So that's where, I don't know, does John Hewson still get counted as a liberal?
No, see, I think that's a spot-on analysis, but I've been working at this for some months. Who is the coalition figure who might break ranks and come out and say, look, up till now I was a sceptic about climate change being real, but I've looked at this data about the melting of the polar ice caps or the melting of the permafrost or whatever, and I now think conservative Australia has to take ownership of this issue. And I can't find anyone who does that at the national level. We saw with the State Minister today that he, like his colleagues in South Australia, and I think in Victoria, though they're in opposition, that the coalition at the state level is saying the right thing about targets for 2050 and even earlier. But I'm damned if I can see anyone, and I don't count Hewson because he's been such a dissident over so many years now. I can't.
He's the Malcolm Fraser of today. Yeah.
Well, he was good this morning on an issue I'm taking up. That's Julian Assange, but he's not. I see no hint that he's prepared to break ranks on climate. So how do you reach out? There are, in the US, there are a couple of Republicans who've said, listen, let's have a tax on carbon and return all the proceeds to the taxpayers. There's at least one who's running a campaign saying that. In Britain, there are some conservatives. You've got a circle, and by and large, British conservatism isn't bad on this issue, going back to Thatcher. But boy, it's hard in Australia. I would love to see what you just described. I think that's crucial, but I cannot see it happening.
I don't think it's going to come from the political class. The group we're in tonight, I think, is a really good example of messaging coming from not the usual suspects. Another group is Farmers for Climate Action, and they've been incredibly powerful over the last few years. They've only emerged in the last few years, but they've filled this gap, this political gap in between farmers and environmentalists, where there shouldn't be a gap, but for a whole raft of reasons, this conflict has emerged, this perception that if you're a farmer, you're in opposition to environmentalists and vice versa. Farmers for Climate Action has filled that gap. And they've had incredible turnarounds. So if you look at statements from Fiona Simpson from the National Farmers Federation, you wouldn't expect that's coming from what used to be one of the most conservative organisations on climate change. Also, some more data that I just coincidentally happened to note down is that from the Australia Institute, the polling in 2017 said that 29% of voters for the National Party denied climate change. They didn't think it was happening. 1 year later, in 2018, that had gone down to 15%.
Sure.
That's really significant. That's a big effect. I'm not going to say it's due to Farmers for Climate Action because I couch everything in uncertainty, which is apparently a terrible thing to do.
Only if you're speaking publicly about something. So,
but these changes are happening. I don't know. I don't think we'll see a politician necessarily, but I think we'll see the forces that act on the politicians. Although we did see Angus Taylor have a pretty profound change of heart very quickly a couple of weeks ago. Little Proud, sorry, is that who I'm thinking of?
Yeah, not Angus. No. Michael.
So today, during a short break, when I was exercising back at the hotel...
Producing carbon dioxide, but anyway, I'll let that slide.
Yeah, but it's neutral because I take in, there was a parliament debate going on. I happened to be tuned in to ABC, of course, national.
At our finest hour.
Well, and there was a discussion about the epic drought and the damage that has done to farmers. And so here we see sort of several things merging together. Getting individuals, organizations, groups that aren't the usual suspects, but also connecting the dots for the public. Because what was the point that was being made by the Labour members of Parliament was that this is climate change. They couldn't get the Liberals to actually agree with that. The Liberals actually avoided even answering the question, was this related to climate change? But to the extent that the public begins to connect those dots, that this drought, which is damaging agriculture, which is destroying the lives of farmers in Australia, to the extent that we can link that to climate change, that allows the public to begin to understand that this isn't just about polar bears off in the Arctic. This is about real-time disasters that are impacting us now in our daily lives.
Typhoons in Japan, if you need to look any further, stronger than ever expected. I should jump in now and say, of course, the media has had a role in totally, not just the Murdoch media, but all of us. The ABC is only now committing to not having balanced coverage, so-called balanced coverage on climate issues. The BBC put out an edict in the last year saying that they would no longer require any representation from climate deniers. The ABC is still formulating that.
The analogy being with tobacco. Long ago made the decision not to have people disputing that tobacco causes cancer. That's the analogy, isn't it, that you're making?
Yeah.
Well, as a
well,
science
it's exactly
presenter.
the analogy, but I just want to make it clear it's not just the Murdoch press, and certainly, media, as everyone knows, loves to have opposition, drama, and tension. Makes for great programming. So Q&A is classic for putting everyone against, just throwing everyone in there and hitting the ratings button on a Monday.
Because they get savaged by the Murdoch media if they don't have.
Let's not turn this
denial.
about the ABC. It's I just wanted to raise the media thing. Sorry, Michael.
I was going to point out, as a science presenter, you would not entertain flat earthers in a discussion of interstellar space exploration. This is to deny climate change is about as scientifically as untenable as attributing.
We did our last event where we had Ian Plimer, who was a prominent climate denier. That was in 1998 with David Caroli on the other side, and it was pretty clear then that we never really needed to reach for the Plimer button again. So we didn't. So it's been, media has certainly obviously played a role in this.
And can I add add to that as well. It's not just the coverage, but it's how we engage with the media too. So we were talking over dinner about this idea of snack news. There's a really cool study that came out actually next year. It's being published early, but published in 2020. And it's looked at this idea of snack news, which is pointing out how many of us engage with media or items of news through our social media feeds. And we don't engage deeply and have a 3-course meal. We just snack on little bits. So we'll scroll through the feed and we get a headline and a little teaser and an image. And this research was looking at what happens if you've got someone that gets heaps and heaps and heaps of this snack news and they don't really get an in-depth article. What they found was that perceived knowledge on the topic goes up really high, but actual knowledge is really low. That might be fine, except the problem is they also looked at what are the trends with the willingness to talk about this particular issue. The strength of opinion and the desire to discuss it are associated with perceived knowledge, not actual knowledge. So the less you know, the more you think you know the truth, and the more you want to tell other people the truth that you've got as well.
Wow.
And
Dunning-Kruger.
Yes,
Yeah.
and we were talking
effect.
about this too, And so it's complicated. It's not just how these stories are presented, but it's how we as consumers of information consume it too.
So we're getting a little bit towards the end. We're sort of probably only got another 10 minutes or so, I think. So I just want to move to some like we've looked at where the failures have been. Now, Bob, you were quoted in one of my favourite newspapers, The Australian, not so long ago, talking about the failure of the Labor Party federally and how we've got to give up basically. Don't leave it to politics. We should focus on letting business and technological change be the drivers on climate action. Is that ever going to be enough? Just business on its own?
Well, it's saying specifically that Labor's target in the last election of a 45% cut by 2030 is really overtaken by events. There's not going to be another federal election for another 3 years, and it's hard to keep Labor adhering to that. But I was enormously encouraged by a conversation with Professor Garnaut, who's got a book coming out, and he's just given 6 lectures that I think will be the core of the book on the economics of climate change. He said this to me, and it's startling in its optimism. He said that he thinks left to investment decisions and pricing, Australia will be achieving something close to 45% reductions by 2030, almost in defiance of government policy in Canberra.
But when you said and pricing, do you mean a carbon price?
No. No action by government except government not subsidising coal. So there's Garnaut, who designed that scheme and knows more about the economics of it than anyone else in Australia, saying all is not lost. We're going to get to that bold, large 45% reduction by 2030, I suppose, as a result of the phenomenon that we've all been picking over here today. That is boardroom decisions. That's investment decisions, which are now running ahead of what government policy in Canberra is. So that's the excitement bubbling away in this forum, and why I'm enormously grateful that it's been organised. We are seeing, in all the presentations we had this afternoon, we're seeing confirmation of that.
Okay, but we've got 2 things there. So the board meeting season is coming up, and there has been, there'll be a lot of activism, a lot of push for resolutions to be adopted. BHP's facing one. So on climate action. So that's something. But cutting off the welfare teat to the fossil fuel industry, how the hell is that going to happen?
Well, we've got a Prime Minister who proudly held coal
that
in the
doesn't
House.
seem to be like it's going to help, Bob.
Yeah, except we've got to assume that there will be sound arguments mounted in a cabinet that has been influenced by some strands of denialism, climate change denialism, about the economic case against continuing the agony of a carbon-based economy. And that even they will see the logic of shifting the debate to another area. That is storage, the transmission system, again, things that were canvassed here today. I'd love to see the pressure from farm organisation opinion, get through to the National Party, but somehow there is a gap there. And you need to be an expert in coalition politics to establish precisely what it is. But in the meantime, the organisations most of you represent are driving the process and providing us with the most hope there is that Australia might get there, despite laggards in charge of policy in Canberra.
And for that we humbly and gratefully thank you. Michael, you've been wanting to jump in for a moment there?
Well, yeah, I mean, so there are these effective subsidies provided to the fossil fuel industry.
400 billion a year globally. Yeah.
And that, that is sort of, that's like a negative price on carbon. So there are different ways to look at this. You can look at it in terms of levying a price on carbon. You can look at it in terms of getting rid of subsidies. But in the end, we have to level the playing field. In the absence of the level playing field, where fossil fuel interests continue to be able to pollute at will, it's very difficult to see avoiding some of the targets that we're talking about, a 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. That requires dramatic reductions in carbon emissions.
Well, we've seen from the UN report it's got to be 5 times the nationally agreed reductions. That they have to be quintupled to affect that.
Yeah, there are different ways to look at it. You can look at the Paris commitments get us less than halfway to limiting warming below 2 degrees Celsius. Now, if we're talking 1.5 degrees Celsius, that probably requires bringing global emissions down by a factor of 2 by 2030 and going carbon neutral by 2050. And it's difficult to see market forces alone in the absence of a price on carbon possibly getting us to those sorts of reductions.
Michael, could I ask you this? Just want to ask Emma to take a photograph of this panel, because I'm so thrilled to be in it, and it's been far exceeded my expectations.
And Emma hasn't got a phone, so...
Can I ask this? In the whole, if we're looking at the whole landscape of business-driven innovation, what have you seen? What have you heard of? Get some more. Give me a choice before I render this famous. What have you seen that's really impressed you as providing us with that technological hit, that unexpected breakthrough that could get us there, that could save us from the degradation of wholesale climate change at 2 degrees?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing an exponential growth in renewable energy and electrification. The problem is that the time scale of that exponential growth isn't fast enough to get us below those emissions.
We want some optimism.
The drawdown technologies.
You've got to
give people hope. Yeah. What have you seen that has given you hope?
No, the optimism is that we're headed in the right direction. We just have to get there faster. And I was going to actually respond to something you had said at the very beginning. Global carbon emissions have actually largely reached a plateau. There was a little bit of an uptick last year, but if you look at the last 15 or 20 years, they've more or less reached a plateau. They may go down this year.
The UN report last month said that they won't go down before 2030, let alone, they won't peak before 2030, let alone 2050.
Well, the numbers that have come in right now have shown a decrease in the European Union, a decrease in the US. We don't have reliable numbers yet for China, and China is the wild card here. But what we did see was that China was decommissioning coal-fired power plants. They were exceeding their commitments under the Paris Accord, and then we had a U.S. president say that he was going to pull out of the Paris Agreement. Since then, we've seen China start to build additional coal-fired power plants, and we've seen their emissions grow. And so politics has played a major role.
Correlation does not causation make, Michael.
Politics has played a huge role. When people ask what was the impact that Donald Trump has had, it isn't on U.S. carbon emissions. It's on the excuse that he's provided for other state actors to no longer meet their obligations under Paris. And the good news there is that with one election, we can change that.
Not that last election that you had, but another election with a different outcome. Excellent. Look, we're not judging. We really do have to wrap up now. So do you have basically drawdown technologies? There's a whole lot of them. Getting the carbon dioxide out of the air because we can't just reduce emissions or stop them.
When people like Bill Gates say we need a miracle to solve this problem, that is extremely destructive because we don't. We have the solution to the problem in front of us. It is renewable energy. All we need are incentives that move us away from fossil fuel, that get us on renewable energy. If you look at academic studies that look at existing technology that we have today, it's easy to see projections which get us to 100% renewable energy by mid-century if we simply scale up existing technology. The good news is that we will do better than that because there will be additional research and development.
But we do need to draw down as well because just not producing more in that time is not going to... We've got too much locked in the system already.
It depends on the target you're talking about. 1.5 degrees Celsius is extremely difficult because we've nearly blown past that. We're already at 1.2. 2 degrees Celsius, we don't necessarily need drawdown to get there. So,
right.
And there is no magic number. It isn't a cliff that we go off at 1.5 degrees C or 2 degrees C.
And
it's a highway we're going down, and we need to get off at the soonest exit we can.
And tragically, those of us who live in places with good roads and good cars are going to suffer the least from it. So I'm all for going for a 1.5 degree if we at all can. Bob, you've said enough. No, please jump in if you do need to. Beck, behaviour change, you've given us some great insights into how our minds work, the tribal thing, and how our perception of what others thinking can affect change, the concerns about political leadership. We haven't mentioned, the Greta effect or the Jacinda effect for that matter, a bipartisan zero emissions bill just passing in New Zealand. Whatever bipartisan emissions bill means, I have no idea. But anyway, pleased that they could manage it. It's going to take more than Greta, but what have you got that's giving us hope on the human change, on the societal change, or is it just a problem too big for humanity to deal with? Please don't say yes.
My truthful part wants to say it is too big for us. But the part of me that's sitting on a stage that has to say something optimistic will say instead that we understand a lot more about what motivates people to change now. So some of the comments Michael made at the start about this idea that scientists just need to tell people the data and then they'll interpret the data and update their opinions in a rational way. We know that's not the case. We know that people are much more influenced by feeling like other folks from their in-group, people that share an identity with them, are doing something. And so if we can kind of catalyse these small changes, that might lead into something bigger. What we really need is not individual behaviour change necessarily. We need systemic change. But individual behaviour change can be like flexing the muscle that lets you warm up to the idea that maybe we can lead into systemic change.
So you're calling for a revolution?
Obviously, yes.
Fantastic. Bob, last word?
No, I'm happy.
Lady... Did not see that coming.
Nothing is more optimistic than the stuff canvassed here this afternoon. Business-led innovation, the investment decisions made by people who thought about this.
Oh, into the mic, actually, Bob. Into the mic.
That might
no, everyone can hear me. That's enough. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us at the bar. A climate scientist, a politician and a social scientist. Thanks so much, Emma and the IGCC. Enjoy dessert, and we'll be here if you want to have a chat. Thank you. Cheers. That was terrific. Great job. You are.